Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you're a returning listener, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, welcome. It's great to have you on board. So without further ado, let's get started on today's story.
The search party that found Don Tidy was fortunate and diligent. Private Patrick Kelly was fatally wounded very near the hideout. Garda recruit Gary Sheehan died in a clump of trees 20 yards away. Forensic and technical experts are continuing their searches around the hideout in a hunt for vital clues.
The President, the Taoiseach, several members of the government and the leader of the opposition, Mr Haughey, were present today at the funerals of the young Garda recruit and the army private killed in the rescue of the kidnapped Quinsworth executive, Mr Don Tidy, on Friday afternoon. Thousands of people attended both funerals.
For those responsible for maintaining law and order, the difference between a successful rescue and a disaster can come down to a razor-thin margin. In the case of Don Tidy's kidnapping, things veered towards catastrophe. The Gardaí initially had reason to believe the operation might go smoothly, but it would end in violence and loss. At the centre of the storm was Galen Weston, one of the richest businessmen in the world. Though Canadian, he had settled in Ireland and taken the helm of Associated British Foods, owners of Quinsworth, which was a well-known store back in the 80s and 90s in Ireland, and other major Irish retailers like Penneys and Brown Thomas. Weston's business empire was vast, and he was a prominent figure in Irish commercial life. Because of that, he had long been viewed as a high-value target by the Provisional IRA. By the early 1980s, the IRA's strategy had increasingly shifted towards targeting wealthy individuals for ransom. These operations weren't just about the funding, they were also about striking fear and asserting control. And so, in August 1983, they made their move. Weston's home in Roundwood, County Wicklow, a relatively quiet and secluded village in the Wicklow Mountains, was chosen for the operation. But unknown to the IRA team, the Gardaí had been keeping close tabs on suspected members for some time. Ever since the kidnapping of Shergar in February of that year, which I did cover in a previous podcast about a year ago, well, when the famous racehorse was taken from a stud farm in Kildare by a group believed to be linked to the IRA, Garda surveillance had been intensified. Special branch officers were working around the clock, trailing suspects and quietly gathering intelligence. Eventually they got the break they needed. A trusted source came forward with details of a planned abduction, and it was enough to set the wheels of a major counter-operation in motion. When the IRA arrived at Weston's property in Roundwood, they were walking straight into a trap. 13 armed detectives from the special branch were already lying in wait. The moment the men crossed into the courtyard, Gardaí moved fast. A warning was shouted, guns were raised, and then chaos. Now, no one can say for sure who fired the first shots, but the exchange of gunfire was intense and it was immediate. In just a matter of seconds, 4 IRA men were shot and captured. 3 others managed to escape, slipping away through the fields and the hills beyond the property. Weston and his wife Hilary, as it turned out, weren't even at home. They had travelled to England to attend a polo match in Windsor. So while they were safe, the damage had already been done, but not to them, but to the IRA's pride. The operation had failed and the organisation was furious. The Provisional IRA was used to operating with secrecy and discipline. To be outmanoeuvred so publicly, especially in the Republic and especially by Special Branch, was humiliating. And in that climate of embarrassment and frustration, another plan began to form. They wanted to send a message. This time, the target wasn't a billionaire. It was someone just a little further down the food chain, but still high profile, still symbolic, and still deeply connected to the same corporate network. Don Tidy was a 49-year-old businessman originally from England, but living in Ireland for several years. He was the managing director of Quinsworth, the supermarket chain owned by the Westons, Associated British Foods. Tidey was based in Dublin, and from the IRA's perspective, he was both visible and vulnerable. A soft target with a recognisable face and regular routines. Don Tidy's personal life was quiet. He lived in Rathfarnham, a suburb on the south side of Dublin, with his teenage children. His wife had passed away from leukemia a few years earlier, and by all accounts he was a hands-on father. He drove his daughter to school in the mornings and liked to keep a low profile. But by late November 1983, he was being watched. At some point, the Provisional IRA put together a new kidnapping unit, separate from the one involved in the Weston ambush. And they began planning. They chose a cold, dark morning in late November to make their move. It would be a quiet, suburban ambush, carried out in the pre-dawn hours on a residential street. There'd be no shootout at the millionaire's mansion this time. The goal was to disappear with Tidey, quietly, quickly, and without warning, and then hold him as leverage. What the kidnappers didn't know, of course, was that this plan too would spiral into something much bigger and far bloodier than they had ever anticipated. It was still dark on the morning of the 24th of November 1983, a cold, quiet Thursday in suburban South Dublin. Don Tidy had risen early as usual to drive his 13-year-old daughter to school. The two lived in a dormer bungalow in Rathfarnham, a peaceful residential area at the foot of the Dublin Mountains. Tidey was driving a dark green Daimler Sovereign, and his daughter sat in the passenger seat beside him. His two sons, who were aged 22 and 19 respectively, were also nearby. They lived at the family home. Their mother had died, as I said, of leukemia a few years earlier, and life for the Tidey family had settled into just a normal little quiet routine. But Tidey and his daughter had barely driven a few hundred metres that morning when things began to feel a little bit off. As Tidey turned onto the road near their cul-de-sac, he noticed a makeshift Garda checkpoint just ahead. Two vehicles were blocking the entrance, a brown Ford Cortina and a silver Escort. One of them fitted with a flashing blue light. A man dressed in what looked like a Garda uniform was standing beside the cars, flagging him down. Now, this wasn't entirely unusual. After the Shergar kidnapping earlier that year and the growing threat of IRA-related activity in the Republic, checkpoints had become more common, especially early in the morning when security operations tended to ramp up. But something about this one just didn't sit right. Tidey slowed down the car. The man in uniform approached the driver's side window, and then, in an instant, the situation changed. The Garda raised a submachine gun and pointed it directly at Tidey's head. Within seconds, two more men appeared. They pulled open the car doors and dragged Don and his daughter out onto the road. From behind them, Don's son, who had been following in his own car, was also stopped. The armed men pulled him out from the vehicle too. His daughter started screaming, and Tidey was thrown to the ground and beaten. The gang moved quickly. They bundled him into the back of the brown Cortina, which had Garda-style, as I said, blue lights fitted to help create that illusion of an official checkpoint. His Daimler, the car that he had been driving, was also taken, but only driven a short distance before being abandoned with its tyres slashed. The kidnapping had been fast and aggressive, but despite the trauma and the early hour, Don's son and daughter didn't waste any time. Once the gang fled with their father, they raised the alarm immediately. Within minutes, the real Gardaí were on the scene. A nationwide alert was issued and the hunt began. The getaway route was carefully planned. The gang sped through Tala, nearly crashing into another vehicle at Bridget Burke's Old Bawn Tavern Junction. But they didn't stop. Instead, they merged into the commuter traffic, heading west, likely blending into the early morning rush hour. Back in Dublin, Chief Superintendent Patrick Culligan was heading up the manhunt. Special branch detectives suspected right away that the Provisional IRA were behind the abduction. The planning, the uniforms, the firepower, and the high-value target all fit their modus operandi. The Gardaí also believed that the team responsible might include members of the same group suspected in Shergar's case, as well as 3 men who had previously escaped from the Maze prison in Northern Ireland. In the hours that followed, checkpoints were thrown up across the country. Every back road, border lane and crossing point were being watched. Despite that, the gang had the advantage. They had a lead, they had a network, and most importantly, they had a plan. While Don Tidy was being driven west, the country was already gripped by the news. Several pirate radio stations in Dublin ignored requests for silence and broadcast details of the kidnapping almost immediately. A media blackout was effectively impossible. By that evening, Tidey's photograph was on the front pages of every national newspaper. He was the 8th kidnapping victim in Ireland that year. But this one, it seemed to hit harder than the rest of them. For the public, Tidey was a businessman, a widowed father, a familiar face. For the government, his abduction was a fresh challenge. Not only a test of its ability to enforce law and order, but a test of principle. Would it negotiate with kidnappers? Would they pay? Behind the scenes, the government's position was firm. No ransom would be paid. Officials remembered all too well the disastrous handling of the Shergar case earlier that year, and they were determined not to be drawn into a public spectacle or a payoff. The Gardaí, meanwhile, were pouring every available resource into the investigation. Intelligence efforts ramped up. Contacts were approached, old informers were reactivated. And through it all, one thing became increasingly clear. The gang had disappeared into rural Ireland, somewhere far from roads, reporters and any normal routine. Tidey, they believed, had been hidden in the woods. But no one yet knew the scale of what was coming. So within hours, a full-scale Garda investigation was underway, coordinated from Dublin but reaching right across the country. From the outset, the operation was driven by urgency. But also there was a fear that this could go very badly, very quickly. The tactics used by the kidnappers, fake Garda uniforms, blue lights, military-grade weapons, made one thing clear. This was a professional job, and the people behind it were highly organised. Garda intelligence units believed the Provisional IRA's South Armagh Brigade was behind the operation. That belief wasn't without basis. Several of the key suspects who led the 1983 Maze prison escape were believed to be active in the Republic at the time. Others were known to have access to weapons, safe houses and a network of supporters. Chief Superintendent Patrick Culligan, who had been in charge of the botched Shergar investigation earlier that year, was brought in to lead the Tidey manhunt, as I said. He knew how high the stakes were. The government were under pressure not to repeat the same mistakes. The Gardaí wasted no time. Roadblocks sprang up across the Midlands. Cars were stopped and checked. Remote houses and farm buildings were also searched. Security was tightened along the border. Suspects were questioned. By that evening, the scale of the operation had grown significantly. It was one of the largest manhunts ever launched in the Republic at the time. Taoiseach Garrett Fitzgerald took a firm public stance. He insisted there would be no ransom paid, no negotiations with terrorists. Privately, though, the situation was tense. Tidey's employer, Associated British Foods, remained tight-lipped, but there were murmurs about whether a payout might be made behind closed doors. Meanwhile, in Tralee, Gardaí arrested 2 individuals, a man and a woman, under Section 30 of the Offences Against the State Act. They were held for questioning but later released without charge. Similar arrests followed in Navan, where 2 more suspects were detained. Again, no charges were brought. The Gardaí were casting a wide net, but they didn't have a clear lead on where Tidey was being held. Suspicion quickly turned to Leitrim. The county had long been a stronghold for Republican support, and geographically it was ideal, remote, close to the border and full of thick forestry. Back in Dublin, Don Tidy's 3 children appeared on national television to make an emotional appeal for their father's safe return. They told reporters, "We have now had to live a week without her father, and the strain has been quite terrible. The greatest worry is the silence. Every time the phone...
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing facility, he knows keeping the line up and running is a top priority. That's why he chooses Grainger. Because when a drive belt gets damaged, Grainger makes it easy to find the exact specs for the replacement product he needs. And next day delivery helps ensure he'll have everything in place and running like clockwork. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Your hopes are raised, and then when it isn't the kidnappers, they are dashed. Tidey, they explained, was in good health. He exercised regularly, walked daily, and was mentally strong. If anyone could survive this ordeal, they believed he could. Still, with no new sightings and no demands made public, the situation was growing more uncertain by the day. As November had rolled into December, the pressure surrounding Don Tidy's kidnapping only grew. Behind the scenes, Gardaí investigators were working around the clock, chasing down leads, interrogating suspects and widening the search across the Midlands and border counties. But with each passing day, frustration mounted. Despite all the resources deployed, Tidey's location remained unknown and no credible breakthroughs were materialising. Publicly, the government stayed resolute. After the botched Shergar investigation and the high-profile Ben Dunn kidnapping, where a payment had quietly been made, the coalition, led by Garret Fitzgerald, was determined not to bow to demands this time. Paying a ransom they believed would only further embolden paramilitary groups and criminal gangs. But politically, that stance came with enormous risk. If the standoff ended in tragedy, public opinion would turn fast. With all the suspects being picked up and questioned and released without charge, the pressure was really on. One case in particular caused unnecessary confusion. William Kelly, a 40-year-old painter from Tralee, presented himself to Gardaí claiming to have inside knowledge of the kidnapping. Under questioning, he admitted he had lied, a false lead that only drained resources and wasted time. He later would be convicted of making a false statement. On the 2nd of December, Gary Weston, who is Galen's brother and the chairman of Associated British Foods, confirmed publicly that a ransom demand had been made. The amount was $5 million, the same sum the Provisional IRA had sought months earlier in the failed abduction of Galen himself. Weston's response was immediate and unflinching. No ransom would be paid. The company would not negotiate. This firm stance wasn't just for the public's benefit. The British government was involved behind the scenes, and under international protocols developed in the 1970s, any ransom-related negotiations required coordination between intelligence services. A special branch officer from Ireland was dispatched to liaise with Scotland Yard, just in case covert negotiations were attempted, or ransom money moved via UK channels. These protocols dated back to a 1973 agreement following a series of cross-border security incidents involving the IRA and other armed groups. Meanwhile, the hunt for IRA leadership figures was heating up. One such figure was a guy named Mad Dog McGlinchey, and he was being closely monitored. He was a leading figure in the Irish National Liberation Army, the INLA. McGlinchey had a reputation for extreme violence and had been linked to arms deals, killings and multiple escapes. Just days before Don Tidy was kidnapped, he had ambushed two Gardaí near Carrigtwohill in County Cork, tied them up and vanished. Their patrol car, bizarrely, would later be commandeered by Gardaí and used as part of the Tidey search. The irony wasn't lost on anyone inside the force. The chaos was mounting. It wasn't just the manpower and intelligence that was being stretched thin. Morale was under pressure too. The secretary of the Garda Representative Association publicly criticised the preparedness of the force. He said Gardaí were not adequately equipped for operations of this scale or danger. Many were using outdated radios. Protective gear was limited. Some special branch detectives were operating in dense woodland with only basic firearm training. His warning, intended as a wake-up call, would tragically prove precedent just 2 weeks later. As the practical search continued, public appeals intensified. Religious leaders added their voices. Dr. Henry McAdoo, Church of Ireland Archbishop of Dublin, and Dr. Dermot Ryan, Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, both made public statements urging Tidey's safe release. They called for compassion, reminding those responsible that Tidey was a widower, a father, and a civilian. At Alexandra College in Milltown, where Don Tidey's daughter was a student, a special communion service was held. Classmates, teachers and parents gathered in prayer, lighting candles and placing messages of hope in the chapel. The atmosphere was sombre but defiant. In Whitechurch, near Atfarnham, a nightly vigil was held at the family's place of worship. Tidey's neighbours and friends gathered outside the church each evening. Some brought lanterns, others stood in silence. A few said prayers aloud. It was a community united by fear, but also by determination. Behind closed doors, some government ministers feared that public sympathy could shift towards negotiation if the situation dragged on. Others, including the Minister for Justice, Michael Noonan, doubled down, stating in the Dáil that no ransom would be paid, not even privately. Doing so, he warned, would make every senior figure in Irish business a future target. But as the second week of December approached, time was running out. Tidey was now missing for over a week. The weather was worsening, temperatures were dropping, and Gardaí, while increasingly certain they were looking in the right area, still hadn't found the hideout. What they didn't yet know was that the hideout itself had been hidden underground, dug out beneath a thick canopy of trees in the forest, which was known as Dorada Wood. The structure was rudimentary, but well concealed, and somewhere inside it, Don Tidy was still alive, but no one knew for how much longer. Despite the scale of the search, the resources deployed and the urgency gripping the country, the Provisional IRA remained one step ahead. They had learned, as I said, from past operations, including failures, and this time they thought of almost everything. From the decoy checkpoint in Dublin to the rapid cross-country escape, the operation was built on speed and planning. They needed a place to hide a man, not just for a few hours, but for weeks, somewhere beyond the reach of road patrols or passing helicopters. That's why they chose Dorada Wood. Dorada was not just your ordinary now patch of forest. It was a commercial conifer plantation outside the town of Ballinamore, County Leitrim, roughly 12 miles from the Northern Ireland border. The terrain was steep and tangled with narrow muddy tracks and thick clusters of trees that formed a natural canopy. The deeper you went, the darker it got, even in daylight. You could lose your bearings very quickly within minutes. This part of Leitrim had long struggled with poverty, rural isolation and immigration. As farms became abandoned and families moved away, more and more of the county was left vacant. Overgrown hedgerows, empty cottages, unused byroads. For Republicans, it was the perfect place to operate without being seen. Dorada and the surrounding region had been used for years as a training ground. In the heart of the forest, the kidnappers set up their hideout. It wasn't a tent, as I said, or a cabin, but it was a hole in the ground, roughly 5 feet deep, 5 feet wide and 14 feet long. The pit was dug into the damp woodland soil and covered with plastic sheeting and camouflage netting. Brambles, branches and dead leaves were layered on top of this to conceal it. From above, it looked like any other part of the forest floor. Inside, Don Tidy was kept under constant guard. As you can imagine, there was no heating, no lights, no creature comforts of any kind. The floor was lined with twigs and plastic. A bale of hay served as a makeshift seat. Tidey, once a high-powered executive in charge of a major supermarket chain, was now living underground like an animal. The men holding him wore balaclavas and boiler suits. They blindfolded him early on, forced him to wear earplugs, and rarely spoke in his presence. When they did, they whispered, often from outside the shelter. He hadn't spoken aloud in days, weeks even. Food was minimal, tinned beans, vegetables, stale bread. Water was brought in periodically. There was no chance of escape and no hope of knowing where he was. Back in Dublin, Garda intelligence began to point in one direction, Ballinamore. The RUC Special Branch passed on information suggesting that Tidey had likely been moved to Leitrim, and Garda officers began to receive reports of known IRA figures being spotted in the region. It was the break they needed. Ballinamore Garda Station was transformed into a command hub. Maps were laid out across tables, radios crackled with updates, officers bunked in shared accommodation and worked 12 to 16-hour shifts. Despite the freezing conditions, morale remained surprisingly high. They believed they were closing in. On the evening of the 12th of December, search units began arriving under cover of darkness. The surrounding woods were divided into grid squares and assigned to each unit. Most of the Guardian soldiers had never worked in this kind of terrain. The going was slow, the undergrowth was thick, the ground soft and waterlogged. They moved methodically, searching for anything that looked out of place. Flattened grass, tyre marks, disturbed soil, footprints, plastic, discarded food tins. Among those deployed was 23-year-old Garda cadet Gary Sheehan. From Carrickmacross in County Monaghan, Gary was only a few months away from graduating from Templemore. His father, Jim Sheehan, was a detective Garda. Gary had joined the force with pride and purpose, eager to make a difference. Operation Santa Claus was his first real assignment outside of the college. In another unit was Private Patrick Kelly, a 36-year-old army soldier from Moate, County Westmeath. Father of 4, Kelly had previously served in the Lebanon with UN peacekeeping forces. He was known as calm, experienced and dependable, a man you'd want beside you in a tight situation. He was armed and assigned to one of the support teams moving through the woodlands alongside Garda units. While they searched the forest, tensions were rising outside it too. Local farmers and landowners were growing increasingly uneasy with the heavy Garda presence. Some were sympathetic to the cause, others were afraid of retaliation. Supplies were difficult to manage, and there were whispers that the IRA had stashed weapons and food in multiple locations across the region. Still, the Gardaí pressed on. By the 15th of December, the pressure was mounting. Don Tidy had now been missing for 3 full weeks. Rumours were swirling that he might have been moved again. Others feared he was already dead. The weather was worsening. Time was running out. And then, early on the morning of the 16th of December, a search team made a discovery. Deep within the trees, tucked beneath a patch of brambles and covered in plastic sheeting, they spotted something odd. A slight depression in the ground that didn't match the surrounding area. When they pulled back the covering, they saw a pit. And inside it, the faint movement of a man. Their rescue was about to begin. But so was the gunfire. By the morning of the 16th of December 1983, the search teams were deep into their second full day of combing Dorado Wood. The Gardaí and the Army had been moving methodically through the dense forest since the early mornings of December 13th, and fatigue was beginning to set in. The terrain, as I said, was punishing, wet, uneven, and covered in thick pine and spruce. Every patch of disturbed ground, every unnatural pile of brush, every scrap of plastic or twine was treated as a potential lead. At around 10:45 a.m, 2 Gardaí attached to Rudolph Unit 3 noticed something unusual in the undergrowth. There was a patch of brambles and branches that appeared to have been carefully laid out, not naturally fallen. Beneath it, plastic sheeting. The officers paused, signalled to the others and began to approach cautiously, rifles raised. They had found it. Just as they moved in to investigate, 2 armed men burst from the undergrowth and opened fire. The officers immediately returned fire and chaos erupted. The sharp crack of gunfire echoing through the trees, bullets snapping against branches, dirt flying as both sides scrambled for cover. In the middle of the confusion, a dishevelled figure emerged from the hideout. It was Don Tidy. He looked gaunt and exhausted. His beard had grown out. He was pale, blinking at the daylight. The blindfold was gone, but he was still wearing the dark boiler suit and heavy clothing he'd been forced into by his captors. For a moment, the Gardaí weren't sure who he was. Shouts rang out, "Down! Lie down!" Tidey dropped to the forest floor and raised his hands. As the shots continued to ring out in the distance, 2 officers quickly reached him. They grabbed his arms and began pulling him to safety. Tidey was disoriented, dehydrated, and unsure where the danger had passed. Meanwhile, further inside the woods, a second exchange of gunfire erupted. Gardaí from other units were converging on the site. The fleeing suspects, believed to be members of the Provisional IRA, split up and darted through the trees. One of them hurled a fragmentation grenade in an attempt to cover their escape. The blast tore through the forest floor. The fighting intensified. When the shooting finally died down, officers regrouped. They began calling out to one another, confirming who was accounted for. And then came the terrible news. Cadet Garda Gary Sheehan had been hit in the back during the firefight. He had been part of Rudolph Unit 5, sweeping an area near the hideout. In the confusion of gunfire and movement, he'd been exposed, likely while advancing towards the noise or attempting to provide support. He died almost instantly. When his colleagues found him, he was lying in the grass where he'd fallen, his rifle still in his hands. Sheehan, as I said, was just 23 years old, a recruit from Carrickmacross, County Monaghan. He had only been weeks away from completing his training at Templemore. This had been his first live operation. The loss was devastating, not just for his family, but also for the force. But he wasn't the only casualty. Private Patrick Kelly of the Irish Army, aged 36, had also been struck during the firefight. He had moved in alongside a Garda unit when the initial shots rang out. The father of 4 from Motion, County Westmeath, had previously, as I said, served in the Lebanon on UN peacekeeping duty. He was well liked, respected, and deeply committed to his role. Despite every effort to save him, he was declared dead at the scene. 2 men gone, one a young Garda at the very start of his career, the other a seasoned soldier and father doing his duty. As soon as the area was secured, a massive search was launched through the forest. Every trail, bog and ditch was swept. Gardaí believed at least 3 of the kidnappers had fled during the firefight. One man, suspected of being involved, was captured shortly after and held for questioning, but he was later released without charge. The rest of the gang had vanished into the wilderness. The border wasn't far, just over the hills and across the Bog Lake, County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland. Gardaí believed the gang had safe houses prepared and transport waiting. Given the terrain and the speed of their escape, it was likely they had slipped into the north within hours, out of reach of the Republic's jurisdiction. Back at the scene, Don Tidy was assessed by medics and airlifted by helicopter to Sligo General Hospital. He was treated for dehydration, exposure and minor injuries. He had lost weight, nearly 2 stone, and was emotionally shaken. But he was alive. For 23 days, he had been held underground, blindfolded and barely fed. The conditions had been grim. And the fear, constant. His release brought a wave of relief, but also sorrow. The mood in Ballinamore and across the whole country was subdued. What should have been a triumphant end to the crisis had instead become a national tragedy. Forensic teams moved in to examine the hideout. They found canned food, blankets and remnants of makeshift equipment. The pit had clearly been designed for long-term concealment. There were signs the kidnappers had made frequent supply runs, likely with the help from local sympathisers. Yet, despite the evidence, no one would ever stand trial for the killings of Gary Sheehan or Patrick Kelly. Later that afternoon, a press conference confirmed what many already feared. 2 lives had been lost. Taoiseach Garret Fitzgerald praised the courage of all those involved. The Garda Commissioner paid tribute to Sheehan and Kelly, calling their actions heroic. But behind the tributes, anger simmered. There were questions asked about how two young men, one still in training, ended up in a live fire ambush against seasoned gunmen, and whether more could have been done to protect them. In the months that followed, both families would speak publicly about their loss. Their sons had done their duty, they said, but the pain remained. The Gardaí had found Don Tidy. The operation had succeeded in that sense, at least in its immediate objective, but the cost was seared into the national memory. 2 uniforms, 2 families, 2 funerals. The rescue of Don Tidy should have been a moment of national relief, the kind of rare victory in a grim era of political violence. But instead, the focus turned quickly to mourning. Their deaths marked a devastating end to one of the largest security operations in Irish history, and for many, they raised deeper questions about how the state was handling the growing threat of politically motivated crime. In the days that followed, Ireland grieved.
The funeral service for Private Kelly, the first member of the army to be killed on active service here at home since the early 20s, took place this morning at St Patrick's Church in Moat. The attendants included the President Dr Hillary and the Fianna Fáil leader Mr Haughey. The Taoiseach Dr Fitzgerald and most of his cabinet were also present. After the funeral mass, the remains of Private Kelly were carried from the church by his comrades. Outside, his widow Katrina was comforted by friends and relatives.
Patrick Kelly was laid to rest in Moat, County Westmeath. His funeral was attended by senior government figures, army colleagues and members of the public who lined the streets in silent respect. His coffin was draped in the Irish tricolour. No ceremonial gunfire was permitted. This was a sombre affair, not a show of force. Garda Gary Sheen's funeral took place in Carrickmacross, County Monaghan. He was buried in the same town where he'd grown up, and where his father, Detective Jim Sheen, continued to serve. Among the mourners was his girlfriend, visibly distraught. She had been preparing for his graduation. Now she was walking behind his coffin. President Patrick Hillary and Taoiseach Garret Fitzgerald attended both services. Bishop Joseph Duffy, in his homily at Sheen's funeral, described him as a young man of promise and courage. In Moat, Bishop Colm O'Reilly condemned the violence and called for unity in the face of terror. The loss of 2 men in uniform, one not even out of training, the other a seasoned peacemaker, resonated deeply across the country. But while the funerals brought the public together, the political fallout had only begun. The government reaffirmed its stance. No ransom had been paid. No deals had been done. Officially, the rescue had been as a result of intelligence, perseverance and the bravery of those on the ground. But rumours swirled. In 1985, the Sunday Tribune reported that Associated British Foods had quietly authorised a $2 million payment through an intermediary in Switzerland. The money, intended as ransom, was ultimately intercepted by Irish authorities. It was later revealed that the funds had been earmarked, at least in part, for use in Sinn Féin's 1985 general election campaign. The discovery led to outrage, and 4 IRA-linked individuals were expelled from Sinn Féin in the aftermath. Sinn Féin's president, Gerry Adams, denied any wrongdoing and refused to condemn the Provisional IRA's actions outright. When asked about the deaths of Sheen and Kelly, he called it part of a wider conflict. His comments angered Garda families and sparked renewed calls to ban Sinn Féin outright, though the government ultimately stopped short of doing so. On the law enforcement front, the investigation continued. Immediately after the rescue, Gardaí launched a massive manhunt across Leitrim and the border counties. 1 man was arrested shortly after the shootout, but insufficient evidence meant he had to be released. A few days later, 3 armed men escaped a checkpoint in Claremorris, County Mayo, after ramming through it in a stolen Mercedes. The car was found abandoned 60 miles away. Gardaí believed they were part of the same gang that had held Tidey, but again, there were no charges. The breakthrough, if you could call it that, came in 1986. Michael Burke, a former member of Sinn Féin with known Republican connections, surrendered to Gardaí. He was charged with assisting the gang and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Another man who owned land near Dorada Wood was also convicted. He received a 7-year sentence for providing logistical support. William Kelly, the Tralee painter who had lied about his involvement earlier in the investigation, was eventually jailed for 3 years for supplying transportation to the kidnappers. None of them were directly charged with the killings of Sheehan or Kelly. The man widely believed to have led the kidnapping operation, Brendan McFarlane, was arrested in the Netherlands in 1986 and extradited to Ireland. McFarlane was a former provisional IRA and one of the masterminds behind the Maze prison escape. He was charged in connection with the Tidey abduction, but the case quickly began to unravel. The judge ruled the evidence inadmissible and the case collapsed. McFarlane was released, having never been convicted in relation to the kidnapping or the killings. In the years that followed, the case remained a point of national pain. For Don Tidy and his family, life moved on, but not without lasting impact. He resumed a quieter life. In later interviews, he reflected on the ordeal with measured calm, saying, "You realise that your life can change in an instant. It teaches you to appreciate the ordinary." He also expressed deep gratitude to those who had risked, and in 2 cases, given their lives to bring him home. For the Sheehan and Kelly families, the pain never fully faded. Over the years, both families campaigned for justice, but no one was ever charged with their murders. In 2008, on the 25th anniversary of the rescue, President Mary McAleese described both men as heroes and stated publicly that their sacrifice should never be forgotten. Memorials were erected in Ballinamore, in Moat, and in Carrickmacross. In 2000, a television documentary had revisited the case, reigniting public interest. Former IRA member and informant Sean O'Callaghan claimed he had passed on information to the Gardaí in the days before the rescue, raising uncomfortable questions about whether Tidey could have been found sooner and whether the ambush might have been avoided. But no answers ever came. The files remained open, but justice, in any true sense, remained elusive. The Don Tidy case stands today as one of the most unbelievable, you could say, episodes in Ireland's modern criminal and political history. It exposed the country's vulnerabilities, tested its institutions, and claimed the lives of 2 men who had simply, you could say, shown up to do their job. Their names, Gary Sheehan and Patrick Kelly, are remembered not just for how they died, but for what they stood for: duty, service, and the cost of peace in a country still struggling to find it at the time. I've gone over this story a lot while putting this episode together. The timeline, the operation, who was where, what happened when, and honestly, parts of it still, they really don't sit right with me. Not just the chaos of the whole rescue or the way the kidnappers disappeared across the border, we assume, but the fact that 2 people died. One that hadn't even finished his training in Templemore, and everything just appeared over time just to move on. There's been speeches, promises, but no real accountability. And I think that's what stings the most, not just for the families, but for anyone watching it unfold at the time. As I said, Gary Sheehan was barely out of college. Patrick Kelly had served in the Lebanon and came home thinking he'd be safer at home. Neither of them signed up to walk into an ambush that day, but they did, because somebody had to go into those woods and try and find Mr. Tidey. And the question I keep circling back to is, were they sufficiently prepared? Did they have the right gear, the right support? And would the outcome have been any different if they did? I don't have those answers, but I think it's worth asking out loud, even now, all these years later. As for Don Tidy, there's no question he went through hell. But in the middle of all the politics and press conferences and rumours of ransoms, it's easy to forget he was just a man trying to stay alive, basically in a hole in the ground for 3 weeks, and then suddenly thrown back into the world, guns going off all around him. It was a strange chapter in our history, really. Part crime, part conflict, part something else altogether. But it does say a lot about the Ireland we were living in at the time. It was uncertain, it was fractured, and struggling to keep a grip on law and order when the rules were being written by people with guns and balaclavas. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now. Do you think the rescuers could have been more prepared going into those woods? Do you think enough was done? Let me know your thoughts. So guys, that's it for today's episode of the Ireland Crimes and Mysteries podcast. Again, thanks for your listenership, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and hit that auto download so you never miss an episode. Until the next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. This podcast has been compiled from information gathered in the public sphere, like news articles, documentaries, and open source material that can be found on the web. Everything in this podcast is alleged unless a conviction has taken place.